The auction block stood in the center of Eureka, Nevada, like a grotesque monument to human cruelty, and Nathan Wilder couldn't stomach the sight of it anymore. The year was 1872, and despite the 13th Amendment having abolished slavery 7 years prior, desperate circumstances and twisted loopholes still allowed men to sell off indentured servants, debtors, and those too vulnerable to fight back. The June sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden platform, where a young woman stood with her chin held high despite the chains around her wrists. Nathan had ridden into town that morning with no intention of involving himself in anyone else's troubles. He had enough of his own, what with his ranch struggling through another drought and the bank breathing down his neck about late payments. But something about the defiant set of the woman's shoulders, and the way she refused to let tears fall even as men shouted crude bids, made him stop his horse right there in the dusty street. $500, a fat man in a bowler hat called out, his jowls shaking with excitement. 600, countered another, this one with tobacco-stained teeth and hands that looked like they had never done an honest day's work. Nathan felt his jaw clench. The auctioneer, a weaselly man named Simons who was known for bending every law until it nearly snapped, droned on about the woman's qualities. Strong back, good teeth, can cook and clean. Contract runs 5 years, gentlemen. 5 years of service, all legal and proper. It was not legal, and it sure as hell was not proper, but the sheriff of Eureka was Simon's cousin, and justice in this town had a peculiar way of looking the other way when money was involved. Nathan dismounted and pushed through the crowd of onlookers. Up close, he could see the woman's face more clearly. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight like burnished copper, and her eyes were a startling green that reminded him of the first leaves of spring. She could not have been more than 23 or 24 years old. Those eyes met his for just a moment, and he saw something in them that made his decision before his mind could catch up with his heart. $2,000, Nathan called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. The square went silent. $2,000 was more money than most men in Eureka saw in 5 years. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with greedy delight, while the other bidders muttered angrily but knew they were beat. 2,000 going once, twice, sold to the gentleman in the black hat. Nathan felt sick as he counted out the money, knowing he had just emptied nearly every cent of his savings. The woman watched him approach the platform with an expression he could not quite read. Fear, resignation. He wanted to tell her right then and there that she had nothing to worry about, but Simons was already unlocking her chains and shoving papers at Nathan to sign. "Pleasure doing business, Mr. Wilder," Simons said with an oily smile. "She is all yours now. The contract states she is to provide 5 years of service in exchange for room and board. All legal." Nathan signed quickly, barely reading the words. All he wanted was to get this woman away from these vultures and tell her the truth. He gently took her arm, noting how she stiffened at his touch, and led her toward his horse. The crowd dispersed, disappointed the show was over. Nathan could feel their eyes on his back as he helped the woman onto his horse before mounting behind her. She sat rigid in front of him, every muscle tense. "What is your name?" he asked softly as they rode out of town. She did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse as if she had been crying or screaming before the auction. Margaret Emmett." "I am Nathan Wilder. I know you have no reason to trust me, Margaret, but I need you to listen carefully to what I am about to say." She said nothing, but he felt her posture shift slightly, as if she was preparing herself for whatever horror he was about to announce. "I bought you so I could set you free," Nathan said quietly. "Once we get back to my ranch, you can go wherever you want. I will give you some money enough to get you to California or back east, wherever you came from. You do not owe me anything." Margaret turned her head slightly enough that he could see her profile. "Why would you do that?" "Because what happened back there was wrong. I could not just stand by and watch." "You just spent $2,000 on a stranger," she said, and there was skepticism in her voice. "Men do not do things like that without expecting something in return. This one does." They rode in silence for a while, following the dusty road that led out into the open country. The landscape around Eureka was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, with sagebrush dotting the red earth and mountains rising in the distance like sleeping giants. Nathan's ranch was about an hour's ride from town, nestled in a small valley where a creek provided just enough water to keep his cattle alive during the dry months. As they rode, Nathan found himself acutely aware of Margaret's presence in front of him. She smelled like soap and something floral, which surprised him given the circumstances. He wondered what her story was, how she had ended up on that auction block, but he did not ask. She would tell him if she wanted to. "How did you end up at that auction?" Nathan finally asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Margaret was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she took a deep breath. "My father died 6 months ago. He was a shopkeeper in Virginia City, about 20 miles from here. He owed money to a lot of people, and when he passed, those debts became mine. I tried to work them off, but Simons bought up all the debt and said I could either sign an indenture contract or he would have me arrested for theft. He claimed my father had stolen goods from him, which was a lie, but he had papers that looked official enough." "That bastard," Nathan muttered. "I thought if I signed the contract, at least I would have food and shelter while I worked off the debt. I did not know he was going to auction me off like livestock." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Nathan felt anger burn hot in his chest. "You are free now," he said firmly. "That contract does not mean anything to me. But you paid for it. $2,000. That is a fortune. Money can be earned back. A person's freedom should not have a price tag." They reached the ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. It was not much to look at. Just a simple wooden house with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, a barn that had seen better days, and a few corrals for the horses and cattle. But it was honest land, earned through hard work, and Nathan took pride in it despite its humble appearance. He helped Margaret down from the horse and led her inside. The house was clean but sparse, the home of a man who lived alone and spent most of his time working rather than decorating. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, 2 small bedrooms, and not much else. "You can take the guest room," Nathan said, pointing to one of the doors. "I will make us some supper, and then we can talk about where you want to go." Margaret stood in the middle of the room, looking around as if she could not quite believe where she was. "You really mean it," she said, and it was not quite a question. "You are really going to let me go?" "I really mean it." She stared at him for a long moment, those green eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "Then let me stay free with you." Nathan blinked, certain he had misheard. "What? You said I am free." "Well, I am choosing to stay here with you if you will have me, not as an indentured servant but as someone who works for her keep. I have nowhere else to go, no money, no family. I know how to cook and clean and mend clothes. I can learn whatever else you need. Just let me stay here." "Margaret, you do not have to do that. I will give you money to start somewhere new." "I do not want your money," she said, and there was steel in her voice. "I want to earn my own way. I am tired of being in debt, tired of owing people. If I stay here and work, I can pay you back for what you spent on me, and then I will truly be free. Free of debt, free of obligation, free of everything." Nathan ran a hand through his dark hair, trying to process what she was saying. "You do not owe me anything. I already told you that. But I owe myself. Do you understand? I need to do this." He looked at her standing there in her worn dress, her chin raised in that same defiant way it had been on the auction block, and he understood completely. She needed to reclaim her dignity, her sense of self-worth. Who was he to deny her that? "All right," he said softly. "You can stay as long as you want, but not to pay me back. Stay because you want to, and we will figure out the rest together. Partners, not employer and servant." "Partners," Margaret repeated, and for the first time since he had seen her, a small smile curved her lips. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of fear and replacing them with something that looked like hope. Over the following days, they fell into an easy rhythm. Margaret proved to be as capable as she had claimed, taking over the household tasks that Nathan had been neglecting. The house had never been so clean, and the meals she prepared were leagues better than the simple fare he had been making for himself. But more than that, she took an interest in the ranch itself, asking questions about the cattle and the horses, the land and the water rights, all the complicated details that went into keeping the operation running. Nathan found himself looking forward to their conversations over supper each evening. Margaret was smart and curious, with a dry wit that caught him off guard and made him laugh. She told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, how her father had moved them west after her mother died, chasing dreams of silver strikes and easy wealth. Those dreams had never materialized, but they had made a decent life for themselves in Virginia City, until illness took her father too. "He was a good man," Margaret said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. "He just had terrible luck." "Luck only takes a person so far," Nathan replied. "The rest is about choices and circumstances. Your father made the choice to take care of you, to give you a home. That counts for something." "What about your family?" Margaret asked. "You never mentioned them." Nathan was quiet for a moment, memories washing over him like a cold stream. "My mother died when I was young. My father raised me and my younger sister Sarah on a ranch in Colorado. He taught us everything about working the land, being self-sufficient. He was a hard man, but a fair one. He passed 3 years ago. A riding accident. Sarah got married last year and moved to Oregon with her husband. I came here to Nevada because land was cheaper, thought I could build something of my own. It has been harder than I expected." "Everything worth having is hard," Margaret said quietly. They sat in companionable silence after that, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Nathan felt a strange contentment settle over him. He had been alone on this ranch for 2 years, and he had told himself he preferred it that way. But having Margaret there, having someone to talk to share meals with, to simply be near, made him realize how lonely he had been. As the weeks passed, Nathan became increasingly aware of Margaret in ways that had nothing to do with the work she did around the ranch. He noticed the way the morning light caught in her auburn hair when she hung laundry on the line. He noticed the gentle way she spoke to the horses, how they nuzzled her hand looking for treats. He noticed the sound of her humming while she worked, old songs from her childhood that filled the house with warmth. He tried to ignore these feelings, tried to tell himself that she was just someone he was helping, that these domestic arrangements were temporary. But the truth kept asserting itself in quiet moments. When she laughed at something he said and her whole face lit up. When she accidentally brushed against him in the kitchen and he felt electricity shoot through his arm. When he caught her watching him work in the corral and their eyes met and held for just a moment too long. It was Margaret who finally addressed the elephant in the room. They had been to town together to buy supplies, and on the ride back, she had been unusually quiet. As they put away the goods in the kitchen, she suddenly stopped what she was doing and turned to face him. "Nathan, I need to know something." "What is it? Do you feel it too?" "This thing between us." His heart started pounding. "Margaret, I do not want you to feel pressured or obligated in any way. You are free to leave whenever you want, no matter what I feel or do not feel." "That is not what I asked," she said, taking a step closer. "I asked if you feel it too." He looked down at her, at those green eyes that had haunted his thoughts since the moment he first saw her, and decided that honesty was the only option. "Yes, God help me, yes. I have tried not to, tried to keep my distance, but yes." "Why God help you?" "Because you have been through hell. The last thing you need is me complicating things, putting expectations on you." Margaret reached up and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. He wondered if she could feel how hard it was beating. "You bought me my freedom, Nathan. You gave me a choice when no one else would. Now I am making another choice. I am choosing this, choosing you if you want me to." "Want you?" Nathan let out a shaky laugh. "Margaret, I have wanted you since the moment you smiled at me that first day. I just did not think I had any right to say so." "Then say it now." Instead of answering with words, Nathan cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, giving her every chance to pull away. But Margaret did not pull away. She pressed closer, her arms wrapping around his neck, and the kiss deepened into something that made his head spin. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure about this? About me? I do not have much to offer. This ranch is barely profitable, I am in debt to the bank, and the drought could wipe me out entirely." "I do not care about any of that," Margaret said fiercely. "I have been watching you, Nathan Wilder. I see how hard you work, how you treat your animals with kindness, how you have never once made me feel like anything less than an equal. You are a good man, and that is rarer than silver in these parts. So yes, I am sure." They stood there holding each other as the afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, and Nathan felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. Real, genuine hope for the future. Their courtship was unlike anything Nathan had experienced before. There were no fancy restaurants or theaters, no society parties or formal dances. Instead, they courted while mending fences and feeding livestock, while cooking meals and washing dishes, while riding out to check on distant water sources and counting cattle. It was a courtship built on shared work and quiet conversations, on stolen kisses in the barn and holding hands under the stars. Margaret proved to have a natural talent for ranch work. She learned to ride better than many men Nathan knew, sitting tall in the saddle as they herded cattle to fresh grazing areas. She could rope and brand, though she preferred the gentler tasks of tending to the vegetable garden she had planted and caring for the chickens she convinced Nathan to buy. "Every ranch needs chickens," she had argued. "Fresh eggs every day, and we can sell the extras in town." She was right, of course. The egg money became a small but steady source of income that helped with supplies. Margaret had a head for numbers too, and she started helping Nathan with the ranch books, finding ways to trim expenses and maximize profits. "You are keeping me afloat," Nathan told her one evening as they reviewed the accounts together. "Before you came, I was barely holding on. Now I actually think we might make it through the year." "We," Margaret repeated, a soft smile playing at her lips. "I like the sound of that. So do I." One evening in late September, as the heat of summer finally began to break, Nathan took Margaret to a spot on the ranch he had never shown anyone before. It was a small canyon about a mile from the house, where a spring bubbled up from the rocks and created a little oasis of green in the brown landscape. Cottonwood trees grew around the water, their leaves already beginning to turn gold. "It is beautiful," Margaret breathed as they dismounted. "How did you find this place?" "I was tracking a stray calf last spring and stumbled upon it. I come here sometimes when I need to think." He took her hand and led her to a flat rock near the water. They sat down, and Nathan pulled a small box from his pocket. Margaret's eyes widened as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band. It was not fancy, but it had belonged to his mother, and it was the most precious thing he owned. "Margaret Emmett, I know we have not known each other long by conventional standards, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You are my partner, my best friend, the person I want to wake up next to every morning and fall asleep beside every night. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face, but she was smiling. "Yes. Yes, Nathan, I will marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They kissed as the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Eureka. Nathan's sister Sarah made the journey from Oregon with her husband, and Margaret cried happy tears at having family present. Some of the neighboring ranchers came too, good people who had helped Nathan when he first arrived in Nevada and who welcomed Margaret into their community. Simons the auctioneer had left town rather suddenly, Nathan learned, after the territorial marshal started investigating his business practices. Good riddance, Nathan thought. The world would be better off without men like him. The wedding night was everything Nathan had dreamed of and more. They came together with a passion that had been building for months, and when they finally lay tangled in each other's arms, Nathan felt complete in a way he never had before. "I love you," he whispered into Margaret's hair as she curled against his chest. "I love you too," she replied. "Thank you for saving me." "You saved me right back," Nathan said. "I was just surviving before you came. Now I am actually living." The next year brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. The drought finally broke that winter, bringing snows that filled the creek and revived the land. In spring, the cattle had their best calving season yet, and Nathan was able to pay off a significant portion of his bank debt. Margaret's vegetable garden expanded, and she started selling produce in town alongside the eggs. Her jams and preserves became popular, bringing in extra money that they saved carefully. But more than the financial improvements, it was the emotional richness that made their life together so fulfilling. They worked side by side every day, building not just a ranch but a real home. They added a room to the house that they planned to use as a nursery someday. They bought more chickens and a milk cow. They planted fruit trees that would not bear for years, but represented their faith in the future. They also became known in the community for their generosity. When a neighboring family's barn burned down, Nathan and Margaret were among the first to show up to help rebuild. When a widow in town could not afford winter supplies, Margaret quietly left baskets of food and preserves on her porch. They remembered what it was like to struggle, to be vulnerable, and they never wanted anyone else to feel as desperate as Margaret had felt on that auction block. By the spring of 1874, 2 years after their first meeting, Margaret knew she was pregnant. She told Nathan one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, something that had become their daily ritual. "We are going to have a baby," she said simply, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. Nathan's eyes went wide, and then a grin spread across his face that was so pure and joyful it made Margaret's heart swell. "Truly, truly. Dr. Williams confirmed it today when I went to town. He says the baby will come in November." Nathan pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "A baby. Our baby. Margaret, you have made me the happiest man alive." "We will have to finish that nursery," she said, laughing through happy tears. "We will have to do a lot of things." baby clothes, a cradle. We should add on to the chicken coop so we have enough eggs, and we will need to build up our savings in case you cannot work as much. And I should hire some help around the ranch so you do not have to strain yourself. And we need to make sure the house is safe. And maybe we should get that milk cow a friend and... Margaret placed a finger over his lips, still laughing. Nathan, we have months to prepare. We will figure it out together just like we figure everything else out. Together, he agreed, kissing her forehead. Always together. The pregnancy was not easy. Margaret suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first few months, and as she grew larger, the summer heat made everything more difficult. But Nathan was attentive and caring, taking on extra work so she could rest, rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings, and reading to her from the newspapers and books they borrowed from the town library. They received a letter from Sarah announcing that she too was expecting a baby, due around the same time as Margaret. The sisters-in-law began corresponding regularly, sharing advice and excitement across the miles. In October, Nathan hired a young man named Tommy to help around the ranch. Tommy was 18, an orphan who had been bouncing from job to job, and Nathan saw something of himself in the boy's determination to make an honest living. Margaret took to Tommy immediately, treating him like a younger brother and making sure he ate well and had decent clothes. "You are collecting strays," Nathan teased her one evening after Tommy had gone to the small bunkhouse they had built for him. "I learned from the best," Margaret replied, kissing his cheek. "The baby came on a cold November night." Dr. Williams had agreed to stay at the ranch for a few days around the due date, setting up in the guest room. When Margaret's labor started in earnest, Nathan paced the main room like a caged animal, flinching every time he heard her cry out. Tommy tried to distract him with conversation, but Nathan could barely focus. All he could think about was Margaret in pain and all the things that could go wrong. Childbirth was dangerous, he knew. Women died from it all too often. The thought of losing Margaret was unbearable. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Williams finally emerged, looking tired but smiling. "Congratulations, Nathan. You have a healthy baby boy." Nathan practically ran to the bedroom. Margaret lay propped up on pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a quilt Sarah had sent. Nathan approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. "Come meet your son," Margaret said softly. Nathan sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the quilt. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his and Margaret's green eyes. He was perfect. "What should we name him?" Nathan whispered. They had discussed names for months but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Margaret said, James Wilder, after my father." "James," Nathan repeated, and it felt right. "Hello, James. Welcome to the world, little man." The baby made a small noise and Margaret laughed tiredly. "He is probably hungry. Dr. Williams said I should try feeding him." Nathan helped arrange the pillows and then just sat there watching his wife nurse their son, feeling a love so profound it brought tears to his eyes. This was his family, his wife, his child, his home. Everything he had never dared to dream could be his. The first months of parenthood were exhausting. James was a colicky baby, crying through many nights and leaving both Nathan and Margaret sleep-deprived and frazzled. But they took it in turns, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating the small victories. James's first smile, his first laugh, the way he started to focus on their faces and recognize them. Tommy proved invaluable during this time, taking on many of the ranch tasks that Nathan would normally have done himself. This allowed Nathan to spend more time with his family, something he was profoundly grateful for. He did not want to be the kind of father who was always working and never present. He had seen too many men make that mistake. Spring came, and with it new life on the ranch. The cattle had another successful calving season. The garden burst into bloom under Margaret's care, even more extensive than previous years. The fruit trees they had planted were thriving, and though they would not bear fruit for another year or two, they represented growth and continuity. They received a letter from Sarah in May announcing the birth of her daughter, Emma. Margaret immediately started making baby clothes to send to Oregon, and she and Nathan discussed when they might be able to make the journey to meet their niece. As James grew, his personality began to emerge. He was curious about everything, always wanting to touch and explore. When he was old enough, Nathan would carry him out to see the horses and cattle, and James would squeal with delight, reaching for the animals with his chubby hands. "He is going to be a rancher, just like his father," Margaret said, watching them from the porch. "He can be whatever he wants to be," Nathan replied, "but I will teach him to appreciate the land and honest work." One evening, after they had put James to bed, Nathan and Margaret sat on their porch as the summer stars came out. It was their favorite time of day, these quiet moments together after the work was done. "You ever think about that day in Eureka?" Margaret asked. "The auction?" "Sometimes," Nathan admitted. "I think about what would have happened if I had not been there, or if I had not had the money, or if I had just ridden on by. I think about it too, how my whole life changed in a moment because one man decided to do the right thing. You would have survived somehow. You are the strongest person I know. Maybe. But I would not have had this life, this love, this family. Nathan, I need you to know something. I need you to know that you did not just save me that day. You gave me everything I never knew I needed. You gave me a home, a partnership, a future. You gave me love without conditions or expectations. You gave me James. You gave me myself back." Nathan pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "And you gave me purpose. Before you, I was just going through the motions, trying to make the ranch work because I did not know what else to do. You made me remember why any of it matters. You made me want to build something lasting, something we could pass down to our children and their children." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Margaret said, "I think I am pregnant again." Nathan pulled back to look at her. "You think?" "I have the same feeling I had with James. It is too early to be certain, but I know my body. I think we are going to have another baby." Joy surged through Nathan. "When, if I am right, sometime in early spring, March, maybe April." Nathan kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and gratitude into it. When they pulled apart, he rested his hand on her stomach. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The pregnancy was confirmed a few weeks later, and this time Margaret did not suffer nearly as much from morning sickness. She said she felt strong and healthy, ready to bring another life into the world. They told Tommy the news, and he was thrilled, already doting on James and clearly ready to be a big brother figure to another baby. The ranch continued to prosper. Nathan took out a loan to buy more cattle, a calculated risk that paid off when beef prices rose that fall. They were able to pay off the last of Nathan's debt to the bank, and for the first time since coming to Nevada, he owned the ranch free and clear. It felt like a monumental achievement, and they celebrated quietly that evening after putting James to bed. "Free and clear," Margaret said, raising a glass of cider. "Just like us." "Just like us," Nathan echoed, clinking his glass against hers. Winter came gentler than the previous years. They had enough hay stored for the cattle, enough wood chopped for heat, enough preserved food to see them through until spring. James took his first steps in January, tottering across the kitchen floor and into Nathan's waiting arms. Margaret, now quite visibly pregnant, laughed and clapped, and Nathan felt his heart might burst from happiness. The second baby came in April, on a warm day when the wildflowers were blooming across the valley. This time the birth was easier, and Nathan was allowed in the room for most of it. He held Margaret's hand and whispered encouragement, and when their daughter finally arrived, red-faced and wailing, he cut the umbilical cord himself. "We have a daughter," Margaret said wonderingly, holding the baby to her chest. "Nathan, we have a little girl." They named her Rose, for Margaret's mother. She was smaller than James had been, but just as healthy, with a cap of auburn hair that matched her mother's. James, now almost 18 months old, was curious about his new sister, gently patting her head under Nathan's watchful supervision. Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. It was busier and louder and more chaotic, but it was also filled with more love than Nathan had ever imagined possible. He would wake before dawn to start the day's work, but now he had James trailing after him as soon as the toddler woke up, wanting to help feed the horses and chickens. Margaret would nurse Rose while making breakfast, somehow managing to do 10 things at once with the grace and efficiency that never ceased to amaze him. Tommy had become more than just a hired hand. He was part of their family, eating meals with them and being treated like the younger brother Margaret never had. He was saving his wages carefully, and he talked about someday having his own land, his own future. Nathan and Margaret encouraged these dreams, knowing he had the work ethic and integrity to make them real. Years passed in this way, marked by the changing seasons and the growing children. James became a serious boy who loved the animals and was already showing signs of his father's patience and his mother's intelligence. Rose was spirited and fearless, always getting into mischief and making everyone laugh with her antics. They added another bedroom to the house, and then another when a third child came, a boy they named Daniel. The ranch continued to grow and prosper under their careful management. They bought the adjacent property when it came up for sale, expanding their grazing land and water rights. Nathan hired more hands as needed, always treating them fairly and earning their loyalty in return. Margaret became known in the county for her preserves and her way with healing herbs. People would come from miles around to buy her goods or ask for her help with various ailments. She never charged much, remembering what it was like to be desperate and poor, and she often accepted barter instead of cash. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nathan took Margaret back to the little canyon where he had proposed. The children stayed with Tommy, who by then was basically family anyway. They rode out in the afternoon and spent hours by the spring, talking and laughing and remembering their journey together. "You ever regret it?" Nathan asked as they lay on the grass watching clouds drift by. "Walking away from the chance to go to California or back east, choosing to stay here with me." Margaret rolled onto her side to face him, propping herself up on one elbow. "How can you even ask that? Nathan, this is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it. This life, this family, I have never regretted staying, not for a single moment. I just want to make sure you are happy, that you do not feel trapped here." "Trapped? Nathan, you set me free, and I chose to build a life with you. That is not a trap, that is a gift. Every day with you and our children is a gift." Nathan pulled her down for a kiss that turned heated despite the daylight and their age. They were no longer young, both in their mid-30s now, but the passion between them had never dimmed. If anything, it had deepened with time and shared experiences. They made love there by the spring, in the place where he had proposed and she had accepted, and afterward they held each other and watched the sun begin to set. "We should get back before Tommy decides we have run off," Margaret said reluctantly. "5 more minutes," Nathan bargained, and she laughed and agreed. Those 5 minutes stretched to 15, but neither of them complained. These moments alone together were precious and rare with 3 young children at home, and they savored every second. When they finally rode back to the ranch, they found the house in controlled chaos. James, now 9, had tried to help Tommy make supper, but had somehow managed to get flour everywhere. Rose, at 7, had convinced Daniel, age 4, that they should give the dog a bath in the kitchen. Water and suds were everywhere. Tommy looked simultaneously frazzled and amused. "Welcome home." I think I aged 10 years in the last 3 hours. Margaret surveyed the damage and started laughing. "This is why we do not leave you alone with them often." But there was no real anger in her voice, just affection. They all pitched in to clean up the mess, and by the time the children were in bed, the house was back to rights. Tommy retreated to his own cabin, shaking his head but smiling. "Our life is messy," Nathan observed as he and Margaret collapsed into bed that night. "It is perfect," Margaret corrected, snuggling into his side. And it was. Not perfect in the sense of being without challenges or difficulties, but perfect in the sense of being exactly what they needed, what they had built together through love and hard work and dedication. More years passed. James grew into a thoughtful young man who had his father's way with animals and his mother's head for business. At 16, he was already talking about ranching innovations he had read about, new breeding techniques and irrigation methods. Nathan listened carefully, recognizing that his son might one day run this ranch better than he ever had. Rose became a beautiful young woman with her mother's green eyes and independent spirit. She could outride most of the ranch hands and was not afraid of hard work, but she also had a gift for drawing and painting. Her sketches of ranch life were remarkably skilled, and Margaret had several framed on the walls. Daniel was still finding his way, but at 12, he was already showing signs of being the peacemaker of the family, able to diffuse arguments and find compromises. He had a gentleness about him that reminded Nathan of Margaret. Tommy, now in his mid-30s, had become Nathan's foreman and most trusted advisor. He had never married, claiming he was married to the ranch, and he lived in a house they had built for him on the far end of the property. He was Uncle Tommy to the children, and Nathan knew his family would not be the same without him. In 1886, 14 years after that fateful day in Eureka, Nathan and Margaret took a trip back to the town that had brought them together. They had business with the bank and wanted to check on some friends, but they also wanted to see how the place had changed. Eureka was larger now, more prosperous. The silver mines were still producing, and new businesses had sprung up along the main street. The auction block was gone, Nathan was relieved to see. In its place was a small park with benches and trees. They stood where the platform had once been, holding hands and remembering. "I was so scared that day," Margaret admitted. "I thought my life was over. I thought whoever bought me would use me terribly, and there would be nothing I could do about it." "I was terrified too," Nathan said. "I had no plan, no idea what I was doing. I just knew I could not let you be sold to one of those other men. Thank you for being brave. For seeing me as a person worth saving. Thank you for staying, for building this life with me." They left Eureka that afternoon, eager to get home to their children and their ranch. As they rode through the familiar landscape, Nathan reflected on how much had changed since he first came to Nevada. He had been alone then, struggling and unsure. Now he had a family, a thriving ranch, a community that respected him, and most importantly, a partner who made every day worth living. Margaret seemed to be thinking along similar lines. "Do you ever wonder what our children will remember about their childhood?" she asked. "I hope they remember that they were loved," Nathan said, "and that hard work matters. And that treating people with dignity and respect is more important than money or status." They will remember all that because you live it every day, Margaret assured him. The years continued to unfold with all their joys and sorrows. Nathan's sister, Sarah, and her family visited when Emma turned 18, and the cousins delighted in finally meeting each other. They stayed for 2 weeks, and Sarah and Margaret became even closer despite the distance that usually separated them. "You take good care of my brother," Sarah told Margaret one evening. "I worried about him being out here alone for so long, but I can see he found exactly what he needed." "We found each other," Margaret replied, "and everything else followed from that." When James turned 20, he announced that he wanted to go to the agricultural college in California for a year to study modern ranching techniques. Nathan felt a pang at the thought of his oldest leaving, even temporarily, but he was proud of James's ambition and drive. "The ranch will be here when you get back," Nathan told him. "Go learn everything you can." Rose, at 18, had been courted by several young men in the area, but she showed little interest in any of them. "I am not in a hurry," she told her parents. "I want what you two have, and I am willing to wait until I find it." Nathan could not argue with that. He and Margaret had been lucky to find each other, and he wanted his children to experience that same depth of love and partnership. Daniel, at 16, was already showing interest in veterinary medicine. He had a way with sick and injured animals, a patience and intuitive understanding that served him well. Nathan encouraged this interest, knowing that following one's calling was important, even if it meant Daniel might not stay on the ranch forever. In the spring of 1891, nearly 20 years after they first met, Nathan woke one morning to find Margaret sitting on the porch watching the sunrise, something she rarely did anymore. He joined her, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders against the morning chill. "Could not sleep?" he asked. "I was thinking about time," she said. "How fast it goes. Our babies are grown or nearly grown. Soon they will have lives of their own, families of their own. That is how it should be. We raise them to be independent, I know. I just wish I could freeze this moment, keep us all together here forever." Nathan understood the feeling. Their life had been full and rich, and the thought of it changing was bittersweet. But he also knew that change was inevitable and often good. "We will always have this," he said, gesturing at the ranch, the land they had worked together. "And we will always have each other. The children may leave, but we built something that will last long after we are gone." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "You are right. I am being sentimental." "You are allowed to be sentimental. I am feeling it too." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, warming the air and painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The cattle were lowing in the distance, the chickens were starting to make noise, and soon the household would wake and another day would begin. But for now, it was just the two of them, the way it had started. Partners, lovers, best friends, everything they needed was right here. James came home from college with new ideas and enthusiasm. He immediately began implementing changes on the ranch, some of which Nathan was skeptical about but willing to try. To his surprise, several of James's innovations worked beautifully, increasing productivity and profit. Nathan found himself learning from his son, and he took pride in passing the torch to the next generation. Rose surprised everyone by falling in love with a teacher who came to Eureka to start a school. His name was Peter Morrison, and he was quiet and bookish, seemingly the opposite of spirited Rose. But they complemented each other perfectly, and their courtship was sweet and genuine. They married when Rose was 20, and Peter became part of the family, teaching not just in town, but also sharing his love of literature and art with anyone who would listen. Daniel went to study veterinary medicine in San Francisco, and his letters home were full of excitement about what he was learning. He came back during summers to practice on the ranch animals, and Nathan and Margaret watched proudly as he gained confidence and skill. Tommy finally courted and married a widow from town, a kind woman named Helen who ran the mercantile. They were happy together, and Helen fit seamlessly into the extended family that the ranch had become. Nathan and Margaret grew older together, their hair graying and their hands becoming weathered with age. But the love between them never dimmed. They still took rides out to the little canyon whenever they could. They still held hands on the porch in the evenings. They still laughed together and worked side by side. In 1895, Margaret became a grandmother when Rose and Peter welcomed a baby girl. Margaret held her granddaughter for the first time and cried tears of joy, marveling at how life continued its cycle. Nathan became a grandfather shortly after when Daniel married a woman he met in San Francisco, and they had twin boys. James eventually married too, a rancher's daughter from the next county over. She was practical and hardworking, and she and James made an excellent team. They took over more and more of the ranch operations, allowing Nathan and Margaret to slow down a bit, to enjoy their grandchildren and the life they had built. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration. Friends and neighbors came from all over the county. There was music and dancing and food, and Nathan and Margaret found themselves surrounded by love. As Nathan danced with Margaret under the stars, he thought back to that day in Eureka when he had seen her on the auction block. He thought about the choice he had made to spend nearly every dollar he had to save a stranger. It had seemed crazy at the time, impulsive and foolish, but it had been the best decision he ever made. Margaret was not just his wife or his partner. She was his everything, his reason for being, the person who made every struggle worthwhile and every triumph sweeter. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, following his lead in the dance. "I am thinking about how lucky I am, how blessed we have been." "We made our own luck," Margaret said, "through hard work and love and never giving up on each other." "True. But I still feel lucky, to have found you, to have built this life with you, to have watched our children grow and flourish. Not everyone gets that." "No," Margaret agreed. "Not everyone does. We have been fortunate." The music changed to a slower song and they moved closer together, ignoring the other dancers. For a moment, it was just the two of them again, young and falling in love on a struggling ranch in Nevada. "I would do it all again," Nathan whispered. "Every hardship, every challenge, every moment of doubt. I would do it all again exactly the same way if it meant ending up here with you." "So would I," Margaret said. "You saved me that day, Nathan, but what you really did was give me a chance to save myself. You gave me the freedom to choose, and I chose you. I would choose you 1,000 times over." They kissed there in the middle of the dance floor, and their children and grandchildren cheered. It was a kiss full of history and memory, of shared struggles and triumphs, of love that had weathered everything life could throw at it and come out stronger. As the party continued late into the night, Nathan looked around at everything they had created. The ranch was thriving under James's management. Rose was happy with Peter and their growing family. Daniel had opened a veterinary practice in town and was already building a strong reputation. Their grandchildren were healthy and loved. Tommy and Helen were content in their little house on the property. This was legacy, Nathan realized. Not just land or money or possessions, but family and love and values passed down through generations. This was what mattered. Margaret squeezed his hand and he looked down at her. Even with silver in her hair and lines on her face, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Her green eyes still sparkled with intelligence and humor, and her smile still made his heart skip a beat. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For staying free with me. For choosing this life. for making me happier than I ever thought possible. Thank you for being the kind of man worth staying with, Margaret replied, for treating me as an equal when the world wanted to treat me as property, for building a partnership with me instead of just a marriage. For loving me, always, Nathan promised, until my last breath and beyond. Always, Margaret echoed. They stood there together as their family celebrated around them, as the stars wheeled overhead in the vast Nevada sky, as the land they had worked so hard to tame and nurture stretched out in all directions. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, a cowboy and a woman he had bought to set free. Now they had everything that truly mattered. Years continued to pass, gentle and full. Nathan and Margaret slowed down more as age crept up on them, but they remained active on the ranch, offering advice and help wherever needed. They spent their days with grandchildren climbing on their laps and great-grandchildren eventually joining the chaos. The little house that had once seemed barely adequate now rang with laughter and life. On a warm evening in 1902, 30 years after that day in Eureka, Nathan and Margaret sat on their porch one last time. They were both in their 60s now, bodies tired but spirits content. They had lived full lives, rich with love and meaning. No regrets, Nathan asked, a question they had asked each other countless times over the years. Not a single one, Margaret answered, as she always did. You, none. How could I regret a life with you? They watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, the same sky they had watched together thousands of times before. The ranch was quiet now, the work done for the day, the family settled in their various homes on the property. We did good, did we not? Margaret said softly. We did better than good. We built something beautiful. Thank you for seeing me that day, really seeing me, not just someone to use or discard. Thank you for giving me my freedom. Thank you for staying free with me, Nathan replied, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and the stars came out, holding hands as they had done for 3 decades. They had traveled a long road together, from a dusty auction block to this moment of perfect peace. They had faced drought and debt, loss and hardship, but they had faced it all together. And in facing it together, they had discovered that love was not just a feeling but a choice made every single day. A choice to support and respect and cherish each other. A choice to build something lasting. A choice to stay when leaving might be easier. Margaret had chosen to stay free with Nathan all those years ago, and in staying, they had both found a freedom deeper than either had imagined possible. The freedom to love and be loved completely. The freedom to build a life on their own terms. The freedom to be exactly who they were meant to be. As the night deepened around them, Nathan and Margaret remained on their porch, wrapped in blankets and each other's presence. They did not need words anymore. After 30 years together, they could communicate in silence, in touches, in the simple act of being side by side. This was their legacy. Not just the land or the ranch or even their children and grandchildren, though all of those mattered. Their real legacy was the proof that love could triumph over injustice, that one person's choice to do the right thing could change everything. That freedom given freely was the greatest gift of all. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched over them since the beginning. And Nathan and Margaret Wilder, Cowboy and the woman he had bought to set free, sat together in the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had created, knowing that their love story would echo through the generations to come. Their children would tell their grandchildren about how Grandpa Nathan had seen Grandma Margaret on an auction block and spent his last dollars to save her. About how she had asked to stay free with him. About how they had built a ranch and a family through hard work and devotion. about how real love looked like partnership and respect and choosing each other every single day. And those grandchildren would tell their children, and the story would live on, a testament to courage and compassion and the transformative power of love. The story of a cowboy who bought a woman to set her free, and the woman who chose to stay free with him, building a life more beautiful than either had ever dreamed possible.